It was close to midnight as Jason drove home after a grueling shift at work. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, and his windshield wipers hummed back and forth, barely keeping up. The narrow streets leading to his quiet neighborhood were drenched, their dim streetlights reflecting off the glistening asphalt. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, his eyelids drooping despite his attempts to stay alert. His mind drifted, thoughts scattered, when suddenly the world erupted into chaos. A bolt of lightning struck a transformer mere feet ahead of him. The flash was blinding, a burst of electric white that painted the night sky and filled the air with a deafening crack. Sparks cascaded from the pole, clattering against Jason's windshield like fiery shards of glass. A static charge prickled his skin, and his shirt clung to his arms uncomfortably. It felt like the storm had reached out to touch him. Instinctively, he slammed the brakes, his car skidding across the slick pavement before jerking to a halt. For a moment, Jason sat frozen in the driver's seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The brightness faded, but the aftershock lingered, his breaths were short, his fingers trembling against the steering wheel. Something about the scene felt wrong. The lightning had been so close, yet there was no thunder. Not even a faint rumble rolled through the air. Jason frowned, his thoughts swirling. He'd experienced storms before, lightning always roared with a thunderous aftermath. Not this time. Shaking off his unease, Jason pressed forward, driving with heightened caution. The rain had softened into a mist, but the silence outside felt oppressive, as if the storm was holding its breath. His headlights cut through the fog, their beams bouncing off puddles that littered the road. Then, he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a dark silhouette on the roadside, partially obscured by the flickering streetlights. As his car crept closer, the figure sharpened into focus, a man, standing perfectly still. He wore a long, dark coat soaked through by the rain and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Jason's stomach tightened. Something about the man's presence unsettled him deeply. The stranger wasn't moving, nor did he seem to be seeking shelter from the rain. He simply stood there, facing the street as though waiting for something or someone. Jason gripped the wheel, his knuckles whitening as he passed by. Stealing a glance at his rearview mirror, he caught the figure turning his head, following Jason's car with an eerie, deliberate gaze. Jason's chest constricted, his breath hitching in his throat. The road ahead suddenly felt darker, the night heavier. A second flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the drenched surroundings, but the eerie silence persisted. Jason's instincts screamed at him to speed up, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the enigmatic man. By the time he turned into his subdivision, relief washed over him at the sight of familiar street signs and porch lights glowing warmly through the haze. But relief was fleeting. As Jason pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, a shiver coursed through him. At the far end of the street, beneath a dim street lamp, the man stood again. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. He had been driving, the man had been on foot. There was no way he could have gotten here so quickly. The logic unraveled in Jason's mind, his heartbeat accelerating into a frantic rhythm. Unable to shake the sense of dread creeping over him, Jason scrambled out of the car, locking it behind him as he hurried into the house. His wet shoes squeaked against the tiled floor, the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. The house felt unnervingly quiet, the ticking of the kitchen clock echoing loudly in the stillness. Jason instinctively double-checked the front door, twisting the lock firmly into place before peering out through the curtains. The street was empty. The man was gone. Jason exhaled shakily, trying to convince himself it was over, just his imagination playing tricks on him after a long day. Turning toward the hallway, he reached for the light switch, but his movement froze mid-action. A flicker of motion caught the corner of his eye. His head snapped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only shadows shifting in the dim light. He laughed nervously under his breath, scolding himself for jumping at nothing. It had been an exhausting day, and the close lightning strike had clearly rattled him more than he realized. Determined to shake off the tension, Jason decided to head upstairs, shower, and sleep. Halfway up the stairs, a faint sound made him pause, a creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. His pulse quickened. The sound had come from the living room. Slowly, Jason turned his head to look down the staircase, his eyes straining against the impenetrable darkness below. The weight of the shadows felt suffocating, heavier than they should have been. He stood frozen, every nerve screaming for him to act, but uncertainty held him in place. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice unsteady as it echoed through the house. Silence answered him, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the windows. The logical part of his mind told him there was nothing to worry about, that it was just the house settling in the storm. Yet, his gut instinct said otherwise. Swallowing hard, Jason climbed the rest of the stairs quickly, locking himself in his bedroom. For a brief moment, the locked door brought him comfort. The room felt secure, insulated from whatever might be lurking below. Jason grabbed his phone from the nightstand, his fingers hovering over the screen as he debated whether to call the police. It felt ridiculous. What would he even say? That a man he saw on the street might have followed him? He sighed, placing the phone down, trying to calm his racing mind. Then, his body went rigid. A shadow passed by his bedroom window. Jason's breath hitched, his stomach flipping with raw terror. His house didn't have a balcony. There was no way anyone could be outside his second-story window. The impossibility of it made his fear spike. He dropped to the floor instinctively, his mind racing for what to do. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice barely steady as he whispered, "There's someone outside my house." The minutes that passed until the police arrived felt like hours. Jason stayed crouched on the floor, clutching a lamp like a makeshift weapon. When he finally heard the officers call out to him, he bolted downstairs to unlock the door. Relief flooded him as the uniformed officers entered, their presence a temporary shield against his fear. But Jason's relief was short-lived. Standing at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the rain, was the man. He hadn't left. He stood motionless, as though waiting. One of the officers shouted, commanding the man to stop and get on the ground. The stranger raised his hand slowly and complied. Jason watched in stunned silence as they cuffed him and led him to a patrol car. The man's head tilted slightly as he passed Jason, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. Later, the police informed Jason that the man had no identification, no weapons, and no belongings on him. He refused to speak, offering no explanation for why he had been there or what he wanted. To this day, Jason remains haunted by the experience. He doesn't know who the man was, how he arrived so quickly, or what his intentions might have been. But one thing is certain, the quiet unease that lingers after the storm is something Jason will never forget. As the storm raged on, I stood motionless in my kitchen, my hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. The faint knock echoed through the house, barely audible over the howling wind and Jasper's low whimpers. My heart raced, the sound sending a chill down my spine. At first, I convinced myself it was just a storm, a loose branch brushing against the house, perhaps, but then it came again, louder this time. It wasn't the random noise of the weather, it was deliberate, purposeful. Someone, or something, was at my back door. Jasper growled deeply, a sound so unlike him that it made my stomach churn. His fluffy white coat bristled as he pressed himself against my leg, trembling but alert. I hesitated, my eyes flicking toward the window, where the rain streaked down in chaotic patterns illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. My voice felt small and shaky as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The words hung in the air, swallowed by the storm. No reply came. Forcing myself to move, I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and switched it on. Its narrow beam cut through the dim kitchen, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. Jasper didn't budge, his eyes fixed on the door, his growl deepening with each passing second. I approached the door cautiously, the cold tiles under my feet amplifying the unease creeping through my body. Another knock reverberated through the house, louder and more insistent than before. It wasn't a sound the wind could make, nor an animal seeking shelter. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to be let in. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear coiled tightly in my chest. Again, there was no answer. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and reached for the curtain over the small window on the door. Slowly, I pulled it aside, expecting to see nothing but rain and shadows. Instead, my breath hitched. The figure was there, standing mere inches from the glass. It was tall, unnaturally so, with shoulders that seemed to stretch wider than any human's. The dim light from the storm revealed long, spindly limbs and a head tilted unnervingly to one side, as though it were examining me. The face, or what should have been a face, was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. My stomach twisted in knots, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Jasper's growling turned into frantic barking, snapping me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backward, the curtain falling back into place as I fumbled to lock the door, even though I knew it was already secure. The house felt suffocatingly small, the walls seeming to close in around me. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a living thing as lightning illuminated the figure again, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the yard. I scrambled to turn off the lights, plunging the house into near-total darkness save for the intermittent flashes from the storm. Clutching the flashlight and Jasper's collar, I retreated to the living room, my mind racing with questions. Who, or what, was outside? Why was it here? And how had it appeared so suddenly? None of it made sense, and the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on my chest. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not from the back door, but from the side of the house, moving toward the front. Each step was deliberate, slow, and heavy, crunching through the gravel and damp earth. Jasper's barking grew more frenzied, and I held him close, whispering to him to calm down, though my own voice trembled with panic. I thought of calling the police, but a part of me hesitated. What would I even say? That there was a figure outside my house, possibly inhuman? Would they believe me? Another knock shattered my thoughts, this time from the front door. It was sharper, angrier, as though the thing outside was growing impatient. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept toward the stairs, desperate to put more distance between myself and the doors. Jasper followed, his nails clicking against the floor as I ascended. Halfway up, I paused, turning to glance back at the darkened living room. The shadows seemed thicker now, more oppressive, as though they were alive. A sudden crash echoed through the house, and I jumped, clutching the railing for support. It sounded like the back door, but when I listened closely, the lock still seemed intact. The noise had been something else, something deliberate. My throat felt dry as I climbed the remaining steps and hurried into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I crouched near the window, Jasper trembling at my side, and peered out cautiously. The yard below was empty. No figure, no movement, just a relentless storm battering the landscape. Relief mingled with confusion, but it was short-lived. A shadow shifted across the glass, and I froze. It was back. My house had no balcony, no way for anyone to reach the second floor from outside, yet the shadow moved unmistakably, as if someone, or something, was standing there. Please, just leave me alone, I whispered to no one in particular, my voice barely audible over the storm. Jasper whimpered, pressing himself against my leg. The shadow lingered for a moment before moving away, vanishing into the darkness. I stayed frozen in place, the flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and my phone in the other. Finally, I dialed the police, my voice cracking as I explained that someone, or something, was outside my house. When the officers arrived, I waited until I heard their voices calling out before unlocking the door. Relief washed over me as they entered, their presence momentarily dispelling the fear that had gripped me. I explained everything as best I could, though I could tell from their expressions that they were skeptical. One officer shone his flashlight across the yard, and that's when we saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the property, barely illuminated by the streetlight. It hadn't left. It was waiting. The officers called out to it, commanding it to stop, but it didn't move. Only when one officer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his weapon, did the figure finally comply. It raised its hand slowly and allowed itself to be cuffed without resistance. As they led it toward the patrol car, its head turned ever so slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was featureless, like a blank canvas, yet I felt its gaze pierce through me. Later, the officers informed me that the figure had no identification, no belongings, and no explanation for its presence. It hadn't spoken a single word during questioning. They assured me it was no longer a threat, but their words did little to ease my unease. To this day, I don't know what it was, why it chose me, or what it wanted. All I know is that the storm brought something with it, something I'll never forget. Even now, every time lightning flashes outside my window, I can't help but wonder if it will return. The storm's fury continued unabated, but my focus had shifted entirely to the unsettling noise that echoed through the house. It had started faintly, barely distinguishable from the wailing wind, but now it was unmistakable, a low, mournful sound, almost like someone crying out in pain. It didn't seem to follow the rhythm of the storm, and it certainly didn't belong in the safety of my home. My heart raced as I stood frozen, flashlight clenched in one hand and the other gripping the edge of the counter for balance. The sound came again, louder this time, and its source seemed closer, as though it was emanating from the very walls. I swept the flashlight beam across the dimly lit living room, its feeble glow creating long, unsettling shadows that danced with the flicker of the candles I had lit earlier. Each shadow seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, giving the impression of movement where there was none. The house felt alive, pulsing with an oppressive energy that pressed down on me with every crack of thunder outside. Despite my growing fear, I forced myself to move, telling myself that I had to investigate. Surely, there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind finding its way through an unseen crack or a branch scraping against the siding. I stepped cautiously toward the source of the noise, my bare feet brushing against the cool hardwood floor. The sound grew louder with each step, resonating through the house like an ominous whisper. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the hallway, where the shadows were thicker, almost impenetrable. I hesitated, straining to hear over the storm's roar, and called out weakly, "Is someone there?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, trembling with an uncertainty I couldn't hide. The response was silence. Not even the sound of the storm seemed to penetrate the house in that moment, leaving an unsettling void in its wake. My pulse quickened, and the flashlight wavered in my unsteady grip. I took another step forward, my breath catching as the noise suddenly shifted, closer now, just beyond the corner of the hallway. It wasn't just a moan anymore. There was something guttural and inhuman about it, as though whatever was making the sound was trying to form words, but couldn't. Jasper, who had been cowering under the table, suddenly appeared at my side. His ears were pinned back, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. He stared intently at the hallway, his body tense and ready to spring. It was both reassuring and terrifying to have him there, his behavior confirming that I wasn't imagining things. I knelt beside him, resting a shaky hand on his head as I whispered, "Good boy. Stay with me." He didn't move, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I tightened my grip on the flashlight and slowly approached the hallway. The faint glow of the candlelight barely penetrated the shadows, leaving much of the space cloaked in darkness. I directed the beam of the flashlight toward the far end, expecting to see nothing. But as the light cut through the gloom, my heart nearly stopped. A figure stood there, motionless and partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were watching me with a curiosity that sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling as I instinctively stepped back. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence more unsettling than if it had done anything at all. My mind raced with questions. How had it gotten in? What did it want? And why wasn't it moving? The sheer absurdity of the situation only heightened my fear, and I felt the walls of the hallway closing in around me. Jasper barked sharply, the sudden sound breaking the tense silence and jolting me into action. Without thinking, I threw the flashlight toward the figure, the beam spinning wildly as it clattered to the floor. The hallway plunged into darkness again, and I turned and bolted back to the living room, Jasper close on my heels. My heart pounded as I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and bracing myself against it as though that alone could keep whatever it was at bay. The next moments passed in a blur of panic and adrenaline. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, fumbling with it as I dialed the police. My voice shook as I explained that someone had broken into my home and was still inside. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes that followed felt like an eternity. I crouched in the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand and Jasper's collar in the other. His growls were low and continuous, his eyes never leaving the door. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew distant, and the wind softened to a low murmur. For a moment, the house was eerily silent, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. I dared to hope that the figure was gone, that it had been some strange hallucination brought on by the storm and my exhaustion. But as I stood and glanced around the room, my hope shattered. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the hallway to the spot where Jasper had been hiding. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever had been in the house wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It had been real. It had been close enough to touch. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief, and I unlocked the front door as the flashing lights came into view. The officers searched the house thoroughly, checking every room, every closet, every corner. But they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no open doors. The only evidence was the footprints, which they photographed before I hastily mopped them away, desperate to erase the reminder of what had happened. When the officers left, they assured me that they would patrol the area and that I should call them immediately if anything else happened. But their reassurances felt hollow. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't something they could explain or protect me from. That night, I sat on the couch with Jasper curled up beside me, clutching the knife and staring out the window as the storm faded into the distance. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the figure wouldn't return. But every time the sky darkened, every time the wind picked up, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it chose my house. All I know is that the storm brought something with it, something I'll never forget. The sound seemed to come from the kitchen, faint but deliberate, as though something, or someone, was there, waiting. My hands trembled as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, forcing myself to move toward the door despite the overwhelming dread pooling in my stomach. "There's no one here," I whispered to myself, repeating the words like a mantra to combat the unease creeping over me. Yet, the stillness of the house, amplified by the storm raging outside, seemed to suggest otherwise. I hesitated just outside the kitchen, my breathing shallow and uneven, before stepping inside and sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. Nothing. The faint glow illuminated familiar outlines, the countertop, the sink, the chairs tucked under the table, but nothing appeared out of place. The sound had stopped. I stood frozen, the quiet almost more unnerving than the noise itself. My ears strained to pick up the faintest hint of movement, but there was only silence. I lingered for what felt like an eternity, willing myself to believe it had all been in my head. But just as my nerves began to settle, a loud, jarring thud echoed from upstairs, shattering the fragile calm. The flashlight nearly slipped from my grasp as my pulse spiked, my throat going dry. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock myself in the kitchen and wait for the storm, and whatever was causing the noise, to pass. But a stronger, irrational urge pushed me forward. I had to know. I had to see. With shaky legs, I made my way to the stairs, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The sound of the storm outside seemed to fade as I climbed, replaced by the deafening thrum of my own heartbeat. By the time I reached the top, my palms were slick with sweat, and the flashlight wavered in my trembling hand. The hallway stretched out before me, bathed in shadows that seemed to move and shift with the flicker of the light. At the far end, the door to the guest room stood slightly ajar, swaying ever so gently as though someone had just slipped inside. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew, without a doubt, that I had closed all the doors before the storm began. My breath hitched as I approached the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, the sound making me wince. Inside, the room appeared as it always had, empty, still, and unremarkable. The bed was neatly made, the furniture undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. I forced myself to check the closet and under the bed, half expecting to find something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. My shoulders sagged with relief, though my unease lingered. As I turned to leave, the sound came again, this time directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight jerking in my hand as I aimed it toward the corner of the room. The beam illuminated nothing but the walls, the steady drip of water from a small leak in the ceiling adding an eerie rhythm to the silence. My nerve finally broke, and I bolted downstairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. Back in the living room, I collapsed onto the couch, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline as I tried to steady my breathing. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the house was unnaturally quiet. The usual creaks and groans that marked its settling were absent, replaced by a suffocating stillness that felt alive, almost predatory. Minutes stretched into hours as I sat there, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls, trying to convince myself that the events of the night were nothing more than my imagination running wild. Just as the knot of fear in my chest began to loosen, a sudden, resounding bang shattered the silence. It came from the front door, the unmistakable sound of it slamming shut. I leaped to my feet, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room as my heart threatened to beat out of my chest. The deadbolt was still in place when I reached the door, and no one appeared to be outside. But the sound had been real, unmistakable. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight onto the rain-slicked porch, but it revealed only the storm's relentless downpour. I shut the door quickly, leaning against it as my breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Then I saw them. Wet footprints, faint but distinct, leading from the door into the house. My legs felt like lead as I followed them, the beam of the flashlight trembling as it illuminated each print. They stopped abruptly in the center of the living room, with no trail leading away. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever, or whatever, had made those footprints was no longer there, but they had been. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight and a kitchen knife, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Every creak of the house made me jump, every flicker of the candlelight sending my imagination spiraling. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, I was a shell of myself, drained and jittery but grateful for the morning's arrival. With the storm finally gone, I searched the house from top to bottom, desperate for some explanation, some sign that I hadn't completely lost my mind. But there was nothing, no sign of an intruder, no broken windows or forced locks, nothing to explain the footprints or the noises. I cleaned the dried footprints from the floor, the act mechanical and detached, as though erasing them could somehow erase the fear that had taken root in my chest. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. I've told myself 100 different stories to rationalize it. Maybe the storm played tricks on my senses, or perhaps I had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was in that house with me. Something that shouldn't have been there. And though it hasn't returned, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back.